Well, hey, folks, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us for this episode of the podcast. A couple of interviews for you in this episode. Later on, we're going to hear from Adam Legge. He's president of the Business Council of Alberta. We'll talk about their new report. It's called From Barriers to Breakthroughs. I think a really important report that comes at a crucial moment for Canada as we struggle to bolster our economy, as we struggle to diversify our trading relationships. How important it is for us to be an attractive jurisdiction for investment so that there's regulatory certainty so that major projects can get built. I think this government has paid lip service to doing all of that, but so far we just haven't seen the results. So this report offers a bit of a blueprint for how we can get there, how we can reduce unnecessary obstacles and barriers and red tape, really expedite the approval process, really spur a lot of that needed investment. So we'll get to that coming up later on. Now, our first interview, we will touch on energy policy because last week the Alberta New Democrats released their own energy policy, Building Alberta's Energy Future, which talks about the need for building new pipelines, LNG capacity, and getting things right in other respects as well when it comes to electricity and renewables. It's really a wide-ranging policy. I think it also illustrates the more pragmatic approach of the Alberta NDP, which in this kind of two-party system, the NDP has become this sort of center-left big tent. Maybe it wasn't, a generation ago. And that's in stark contrast to what's happening with the Federal NDP. Now, the Federal NDP has gone through hell over the last couple of years. I mean, they've been reduced to non-party status in the House of Commons, almost become somewhat irrelevant. And that's been an opportunity for someone like Avi Lewis to come along. And he is now the new leader of the NDP. In fact, he was crowned the new leader the day after the Alberta NDP released this new energy policy. So now at the federal level, you've got somebody who's an avowed opponent of building new pipelines and energy infrastructure, among other things. This all harkens back to a decade ago when Rachel Notley was still premier. And she pushed back when the federal NDP was flirting with something called the LEAP Manifesto that embodied a lot of these far left ideas. Of course, the LEAP Manifesto, one of the key architects of that was Avi Lewis. So it's not just that the federal NDP is kind of flirting with Avi Lewis's ideas. The NDP basically now is the party of Avi Lewis's ideas. And if that was a headache for Rachel Notley a decade ago, it's an even bigger headache right now for Naheed Nenshi in the Alberta NDP. I mean, we'll have a provincial election next year. I think you've seen already, just over the last couple of years, how effective the UCP has been in framing the Liberal NDP alliance or the Trudeau-Singh alliance and hanging that on the NDP, that they're a part of it. Now, in fairness, I mean, the NDP is unique in Canada with political parties. There's no distinction between federal and provincial parties. They're kind of seen as one entity. Now, there's been a push in Alberta to change that at least. Like now, for example, you can be a member of the Alberta NDP without being a member automatically of the federal party. But is there a need to go even further? Is there a need to sever those ties altogether? And I think that's something the Alberta NDP is grappling with. Now, in fairness, too, I mean, Naheed Nenshi has made it clear he wants nothing to do with, as he called it, the LEAP Manifesto cliff jumpers. He put out a statement right after Avi Lewis's victory, distancing himself from Avi Lewis and from the federal party. But still, I think that albatross is there. And I'm curious to see how the Alberta NDP gets around that. So I had an opportunity for a conversation with Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi about that whole dynamic, about how he's responding to what's happening at the federal level with the NDP, and to also talk more about what's going on in Alberta. So many important issues right now when it comes to the economy, education, of course, a likely referendum later this year on Alberta separation. Also, some important developments when it comes to electoral boundaries in Alberta. And the question as to whether the government is tempted at all to engage in some gerrymandering here. So we got into all of those issues in a conversation this week with Alberta NDP Naheed Nenshi. Here's that conversation. Well, very pleased to welcome to the program. He is the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona, official opposition leader, and of course, leader of the Alberta NDP, Naheed Nenshi. So great to have you with us here.
Oh, it's great to be on, Rob, and great to see and hear you.
Let's talk about what's going on within the NDP, the Alberta NDP, the federal NDP, seemingly going in divergent directions here. Let me get your thoughts, first of all, because you've been pretty outspoken about where things are headed at the federal level. Now with the ascension of Avi Lewis, where do things stand here?
Well, I think that it's an interesting conversation for people who love politics. a less interesting conversation for Albertans who are looking for a better government. Because at the end of the day, he's got his job. Mr. Lewis has his job federally, and the federal NDP is not in the strongest position it's ever been, if I can be kind about it. Meanwhile, the provincial sections of the New Democrat Party are doing really well. So from Ontario West, the vast majority of the country, the NDP is either the government or the official opposition. And our job here in Alberta, as Carla Beck's job in Saskatchewan, as Marit Stiles' job in Ontario, is less about rebuilding a movement and more about proving to Albertans, in my case, that we are the best government alternative for them. We are the government in waiting. And so our policies have to be policies that we're ready to implement on day one when we get into office. And by necessity, the Alberta New Democrats are, and I'm very proud that we are, a very big tent. So we have certainly a bunch of people who support the federal New Democrats. We got a bunch of people who support the federal Liberals. There are a surprisingly huge number of Poilievre Nenshi voters, people who support the federal Conservatives, and people who have no particular federal affiliation who are supporters of the Alberta New Democrats. And so for me to manage that big tent in a way that really meets the needs of Albertans, it's a very different challenge than Avi Lewis has. And, while we share a lot of the same principles, we are the party of public health care, we are the party of public education and good jobs-driven growth and the party of workers. We certainly don't agree on energy, but ultimately it's not that important to me because at the end of the day, the Premier of Alberta and the Prime Minister of Canada are the ones who will be setting the energy policy that creates the jobs. And others may disagree, but if they're not in a position to implement what they're doing, what's much more important to me is to be in the position where I can implement what I'm promising, including the Alberta New Democrat energy policy.
Right. I think this, they can make it more difficult for you to do that job, to implement that policy. Do you feel like there's a need to refocus the party at all? I know you've already taken steps, to be a member of the Alberta New Democrats doesn't now automatically make you a member of the federal party. I believe that change was last year.
That's right.
Does it need to go further than that?
Well, here's the thing. You said they can make it more difficult. Frankly, the only way they can make it more difficult is if Albertans are getting confused on what they're voting for. So Albertans need to understand that if they strike a ballot for the Alberta New Democrats, that means me and Raki Pancholi and my team and all those great MLAs now. It doesn't mean you're voting for Avi Lewis. Now, of course, the Conservatives would love to have it differently. And I actually think it's super funny that for the last 3 days, we've had the Premier of Alberta spending her time, instead of fixing healthcare or schools, quoting chapter and verse Chapter 75, sub 2, sub A, sub 4 of the Federal NDP Constitution, which might imply that somehow we have some connection with somebody. I love that she's doing it because every day she's doing it, she not only loses her own credibility, but it's a day that she can't be further destroying Alberta. So I have much, much more faith in Albertans than she does, and in their judgment and in their ability to understand that we stand for what we stand for. And if you don't mind, Rob, I'll tell you that a week ago, so I've got this big tent. I've got a caucus that's a really big tent. My caucus members federally probably vote in different ways. I don't ask them, but I suspect they do. But last Friday, we were really able to release our first look. I call it a first look at our energy policy. And I'm really proud of it because I think it squares the circle. My caucus is behind it 100%. And it does talk about the need for more pipelines. It talks about how in a globally uncertain world, instead of creating more uncertainty at home, let's focus on real market access for crude oil. That means building pipelines, and in particular, a candidate we haven't heard a lot about, but I think is the best candidate. So start with optimizing the Trans Mountain expansion. That's 300,000 barrels a day that can get on board pretty quick. And then consider building a new pipeline, not to the northwestern coast of BC, but to the southern coast of BC. That way you go along the Trans Mountain right-of-way, places where the permitting is already mostly in place, and it's probably much easier and cheaper to get done, and could probably be a win-win with Indigenous communities and the government of British Columbia. I love Energy East. Maybe right now the economics finally make Energy East practical. I love it as a nation-building project that goes across 6 provinces. But also we have to talk about natural gas. We have to talk about critical minerals. We have to talk about value-added petrochemical and other industries. And we really have to talk about electricity. So the government has made a mash of the electricity system. People's bills have skyrocketed. But if we get electricity right, we can attract billions of dollars of investment, create tons of jobs, lower people's electricity bills, and create what I call electricity pipelines between us and our neighbors that really make the whole grid work better as we electrify. So I'm really excited about that because I think it helps us get access for our product while slashing emissions, while creating jobs. It's a hard trick, but we've been thoughtful about it instead of just picking fights with the federal government. And I think that's what Albertans are looking for.
Well, certainly the premier. I mean, one day, she's getting along with the prime minister. The other day, she's, as you say, picking fights. I mean, here we are speaking on what I guess is supposed to be the deadline for some of the aspects of this memorandum of understanding. We hear that there's progress being made, but it's hard to know where things stand. I mean, what's your position on the MOU and your view of where things stand here?
Well, there's a guy in Ottawa who probably said it best when he said, memorandums don't get anything built. That guy's called Pierre Poilievre. And so the real issue is, look, everything in the MOU it's fine. It's pretty much what Rachel Notley did when she was the premier. And for 7 years, the UCP just fought with Ottawa instead of going back to basics on what we already had in place before. The challenge with the MOU is it required 4 decisions to be made by April 1st, which is the day we're recording this. 2 of them required the federal government to act, and the federal government has done that. And those 2 are in place on environmental assessments and methane. The other 2 require the provincial government to act, and those are the 2 that aren't done yet, because the province is just not willing to roll up its sleeves, make the compromises, do the negotiations, and get the work done. And I think that's the critical question. So she's spending all her time, for example, trying to tie me to the federal NDP when she is not, in fact, in agreement with the federal Conservatives on this issue. And we're not being able to move forward. I'll just give you a quick bracket example, if you don't mind, Rob, which is today, the Minister of Attainable, I can never remember his new title, but Jason Nixon, the Minister of Assisted Living, there you go, which also includes housing, got up and just breathed fire as he does at the federal government because they're threatening to take away some housing funding from the city of Red Deer because the city of Red Deer is not doing the blanket rezoning. Now, that's fine and dandy, and I don't believe that the federal government should be telling municipal governments how to do zoning. But here's the issue. You know whose policy it is that all municipalities have to have blanket rezoning or risk losing federal funds? It's Poilievre's policy. It's the cornerstone of his housing policy in the last election. And I disagreed with it when it was his policy. I disagree with it when it's the federal government's policy. But I find it super amusing that the premier stands in front of a mic and goes, Avi Lewis is not Nenshi's boss. And Jason Nixon at the very next same scrum says, I hate what Pierre Poilievre believes. Doesn't make any sense.
Well, the dynamic of internal politics and how it's affecting all of this, certainly I think there's some reluctance on the part of the government to make some progress and compromises on industrial carbon pricing. Mm-hmm. And we see what's going on within the UCP right now. I mean, there's the separatist element within the party. They were railing against the MOU when it was first announced. It seems like the premier is certainly sensitive to what kind of criticism is coming from that section of her party. What do you make of how this is shaping the government's approach on all of this?
Well, the whole thing is weird, right? I have this giant big tent caucus and party, and somehow we're able to be unified. But the folks in power that have a U in their name for United are anything but. And, I sit there and I'll be super politically nerdy for a second with you, Rob, because, your audience. But I sit in that legislature every day and I look across and all I see is people questioning their life choices. So Jason Steffen, the MLA for Red Deer South, just came out as a full-throated separatist. Dan Williams, the Minister of Municipal Affairs, who learned politics at the knee of Jason Kenney when he was his staffer in Ottawa, sits right in front of him. And Dan Williams stands up, and he's the only member of cabinet who has ever said the following words: I am a proud Canadian. Without any qualification, and a proud Albertan, without sovereign Alberta within a united Canada word salad. So I actually stood up in the House the other day and said, the Premier doesn't tolerate dissents, but that guy says he's a proud Canadian. That guy's a full-throated separatist. which one is she kicking out of her caucus? And of course she can't, because she's pandering to the separatists, and she admitted as much on her radio show last year when she was asked, instead of saying, well, Alberta has a raw deal, we have legitimate grievances, blah, 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 like David Cameron and Brexit. She actually said, if I don't pander to the separatists, I won't be the premier anymore. So she's in a tough position, but who really gets hurt by that? Albertans. So at the end, this government is so distracted, they can't actually fulfill on their basic commitments to run healthcare and education and public safety and reduce the cost of living, the things that Albertans care about. And they're relying on crazy amounts of virtue signaling. So they just tabled an education bill today, which doesn't lower classroom sizes or reduce complexity, but it makes sure that no school is ever named after someone the Conservatives don't like. It makes sure that you can't fly any flag except for the Canadian and Alberta flag, which is ironic because they said that in a legislature that has tons of flags flying from different places. You can't fly any flag, which includes the Treaty 7 flag, the Métis flag, the Franco-Albertan flag. Of course, what they're trying to do is ban the Pride flag. But they're not even brave enough to tell Albertans that that's what they're trying to do. But they're wasting our time and our money. They actually had bureaucrats scan the entire Schools Act to make sure they remove the word diverse and the word welcoming from that act, because I suppose they don't want public schools to be diverse or welcoming. How does this help anybody? And so, frankly, I'm perfectly happy to have the Premier read the NDP Constitution all night, because it prevents her from hurting people even more.
Well, the Separatists claim that they've passed the petition threshold, and I guess we'll have to wait and see if that is indeed verified. Where is this going? I mean, the Premier and her government, they've changed the rules around all of this a few times. She's already set a referendum day. I mean, are we headed toward a separatist vote here?
Yeah, we absolutely are. And the Premier seems surprised by that, or she doesn't seem actually prepared for that, which is funny because, as you say, they met their target. But the only reason they met the target is because the target was significantly lowered by the Premier the third time they amended their own referendum act. They're about to amend it the fourth time. And so she lowered it for them. But I got to believe that they never thought that the separatists would get the signatures because they're so woefully unprepared. We know that the question on the petition is unconstitutional. A judge has already told us that. We know that the law says you can't put forward an unconstitutional question. So I don't know how she's going to fix that. Meanwhile, the Forever Canadian petition, which got 5 times the signatures, has been stuck in legislative committee limbo for 6 months because they don't know how to deal with that either. So this is a real big problem. And just as recently as this weekend, the Premier was on a podcast and she was musing, saying, if the separatist referendum is on the same day as my referenda, then maybe we'll just count. She said, we'll count the separatist referendum first. And in the House, she said she meant then they'll count the other ones later. But on the podcast, it certainly sounded like she was saying, we'll count the separatist one first, and if it passes, we don't have to bother with the other ones. So basically, they're making it up as they go along. It's disgusting because they're treating it like it's simple, but it's the future of the country. And just ask anyone who lived through 1980 or 1995 in Quebec, or anyone who lived through Brexit, who realized that the future of a nation is not something you trifle with or play political games with the way they are. There's very real consequences. Investment in Alberta has frozen. Job creation has frozen. The CEO of ATCO, one of Alberta's largest companies, has said more or less that she's not going to invest in Alberta until the separatism garbage is gone. And people are angry. It's pitting neighbor against neighbor against neighbor. And we all know that polls are incredibly hard to predict. I should say referenda are incredibly hard to predict in polls. And Brexit was polling roughly where the separatists are polling now in Alberta, and then it passed. So she started a fire, and she has no idea what the phone number of the fire department is.
Well, I think this all ties together. Obviously, Albertans are concerned about where this is all headed. There's the economic uncertainty that creates and just all the additional pressure, affordability, especially with oil prices soaring. There are a lot of large concerns that Albertans are grappling with at the moment. How are you tackling all of that in terms of, listening to Albertans, engaging with Albertans and trying to see, what the best direction is?
This is the biggest difference between my current job and my old job as mayor of Calgary. Because in my old job, I was able to respond quickly to change. Maybe we could do a property tax rebate this year. Maybe we can deal with affordability right away, that kind of thing. But this government is unable to pivot. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll answer your question directly. But the gas tax, so the gas prices are so high. We all know that. They've gone up 40 cents a liter in a month. And I have just a little fuel efficient car, and I kind of gulp every time I have to go to the pumps because I have to drive between Calgary and Edmonton a lot. And it's hurting people. It really is. And, jar of peanut butter is $7 now. I don't buy grapes anymore. Look, I have money, but I'm so shocked at the price of grapes. And I think about moms who can't afford grapes for their kids. 30% of Calgarians are food insecure. But it so turns out that even though the price of gas is so much higher than it was the last time we got gas tax relief, the legislation is written in a really weird way that the period of time over which the gas tax relief is calculated is a certain number of days every quarter. And by pure coincidence, that number of days in the last quarter ended 2 days after the invasion or the war in Iran. If that war had been 3 weeks earlier, we'd all be paying 13 cents less a liter today. That's just legislation. The legislature is in session. The government is getting a huge windfall. It would literally take 5 minutes for the minister to come to the legislature and say, I'm amending the legislature one time only. Instead of those 16 weeks or 16 days, we'll focus on these 16 days and we'll give everybody 13 cents a liter back. He could do that easily. They're not doing it. And today in the House, he said, well, if the prices stay really high in the month of June, you might get some relief in the month of July. It's crazy. And, well, he needs the money because he's got such a huge deficit. That's the real reason. But the point is that they're really not able to do this. And we've been spending so much time talking to Albertans. Last summer, we launched something called Better Together. We had town halls across the whole province, 10 of them, from Grand Prairie to Lethbridge. We got nearly as many people as our town halls as went to the government's round tables, right? Alberta Next panels, that's what they were called. We didn't get any press coverage because we weren't spending taxpayer money advertising them, but we still got just as many people. And I talk to people across the province, and my MLAs do, and we hear something consistently. People are really worried about the cost of living. They're really worried about jobs now and in the future. They're really worried about public health care. They're worried about the state of public education, especially since the teachers' strike, nothing has gotten better. And they're worried about public safety. And quite frankly, beyond virtue signaling, the government's not doing anything about any of those things. And so my job is to really show Albertans, look, we got your back, but we also have sensible, practical solutions to deal with this. So I'll give you a simple example, grocery prices. Yeah. There's a couple of things we can do right away that are within the government's control to attack grocery prices. There's a lot of bigger things, but there's a couple of easy ones. One is to pass the same legislation that other jurisdictions have passed on the concept of shrinkflation. It's very simple. When you force manufacturers to divulge on the label that this is now a smaller package than it was before, the practice of shrinkflation stops. We could do that today. We recommended that in the legislature, and the UCP turned it down. In cities, there is the practice of restrictive covenants, which sometimes prevent grocery stores from coming into a place where a grocery store is closed, leading to food deserts and less competition, and really preventing independent food sellers like the greengrocers in Calgary, Daily Fresh Produce, and others from setting up in different neighborhoods. The government could get rid of those restrictive covenants and open the door to lower food options and breaking the food oligopoly, but they won't do that. And so we're trying to be focused on the practical solutions that will make people's lives better every day.
Let me just ask you about one more issue, and it concerns Alberta's electoral boundaries and in the ridings that constitute this province. Alberta is growing. The Electoral Boundaries Commission has said, it's time maybe that the legislature grow as well. They've come out with a report looking at how this could all be done, and that would involve redrawing some of these lines. Now, the government hasn't committed to implementing the majority report, and there was some other suggestions along the way that seemed like they could be advantageous to the UCP. Now, the Justice Minister suggested you're wearing a tinfoil hat by suggesting that they're looking at some of those other options, but where do things stand right now?
I would be happy to take off my tinfoil hat and give it right back to the Chemtrail Caucus across the aisle if the minister or the premier would simply say, we will put the Boundary Commission recommendations to a vote of this legislature. Why won't they just say that? So I'll tell you, I'll delve deep into the politics with you here, Rob. So adjust your tinfoil hat because it's all true. We know that this government takes all its cues from Trump, from what's going on with US Republicans. And we know that the US Republicans have taken gerrymandering, which is the art of drawing electoral maps for your own political advantage, to beyond the pale. And the Supreme Court of the United States has not stopped this. And it's a disaster because they think they can only win by cheating. So the way this independent boundary commission works is we appoint 2 members, they appoint 2 members, and they appoint the chair who's supposed to be neutral. And so they appointed their 2 members, we appointed our 2 members, and we were not being partisan about this. I actually appointed the leader of another political party as one of my appointees, the former leader, Greg Clark, just because he's really, really smart. And I figured that he would be able to do a good job on this. And we appointed the former mayor of Sylvan Lake to this panel, and they did do a good job. So what happened was, through the fall, they had all these public hearings. Thousands of Albertans came out, and thank you to all the Albertans who did, to give their input. And they gave us a unanimous interim report that had no gerrymandering in it. It wasn't everything I wanted. I would love there to be one riding in Medicine Hat, for example. I would love there to be no rural-urban hybrid ridings. But it was fair and it was right, and they took a hard problem that the government had given them, which is draw a new map with 89 seats that somehow reflects the massive population growth in the big cities. So they did it, and it was unanimous. And during that entire time, when the government thought that the commission would do what they wanted, they said, we respect the process. The commission is independent. Respect the process. Respect the process. And politicians should never be drawing their own maps. Then there was a second round of public hearings. And again, the vast majority of Albertans said, these are great maps. We're happy. But a few Albertans across the whole province started showing up at the commission with new maps, which is very weird. Like, what average Albertan is going to have the GIS software to draw a new map? And they were showing these new maps, and they were all kind of in the same style and the same fonts and everything. And they were crazy. Like, divide the city of Calgary such that 11 Calgary ridings become rural ridings with a few Calgary people in them. Divide the city of Lethbridge up like a pizza into 4 pieces so that the people of Lethbridge are not the majority in any riding. And it goes out 30, 50, 100 kilometers from the center of Lethbridge. So these were crazy maps. And the UCP appointees who had been part of the unanimous report before did a sudden about-face and put out a minority report that, surprise, surprise, had its own maps. This has never been done in Alberta history, to have a minority report with its own maps. And those maps, surprise, were the same fonts and the same style as the maps that were being handed about. We've heard that the Minister of Transportation was overheard this weekend. This is hearsay, but he didn't deny it, saying to a constituent, the majority report doesn't matter. Look at the minority report. We've heard that members of the Premier's office staff have been handing out those maps, the non-real maps, telling people to prepare for elections on these maps. And so the minister then, on Monday, when he was asked, said all options are on the table. Then the next day he accused me of wearing a tinfoil hat. Right. So the way to get my tinfoil hat off is just to say all options are not on the table, and we're going to let the members of the Legislative Assembly vote yes or no on the one recommendation of the commission. They're pretending the minority report is a recommendation. They're pretending a letter from the chair of the commission is another recommendation. There's only one recommendation of the report, and it's only the one map, and it's the majority recommendation. And if they put it up to the legislature, even if it's a free vote, which they seem to be hinting at today, that would be okay. But I think they're going to try and figure out a way that the MLAs will redraw the map, which means the Premier will redraw the map, which goes exactly against what they said, which is that politicians should never draw their own maps. Now, this sounds crazy nerdy, right, but it is fundamental. If you have that much disdain for democracy, if you're willing to cheat that much because you're scared of losing an election, then you have no right to be in government.
Well, yet another important issue Albertans need to be paying close attention to this year. So much going on, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks again for making some time for us here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, and our thanks again to Naheed Nenshi, of course, the MLA for Edmonton Strathcona, Alberta's official opposition leader of the Alberta New Democrats. So it'll be interesting to see how they manage to create some distance between themselves and where Avi Lewis is taking the federal NDP. I think it's going to be a real challenge for them politically, and already they're coming from a starting point of trailing the UCP in the polls. And I know there's been some grumbling amongst progressives and NDP members in Alberta that maybe the leadership of Naheed Nenshi has been underwhelming or a disappointment so far. He's still got time to turn some things around, but I think what's happening with the federal NDP just makes his job that much more difficult. We'll see how that all plays out. Now, of course, we did touch on energy policy in the conversation with Naheed Nenshi, and I think that's such a crucial issue right now. To that end, I want to turn our attention to a major new report out from the Business Council of Alberta that highlights some issues that hopefully the federal government is prepared to address. We need to get a lot more serious when it comes to expediting the process for building major new infrastructure, eliminating unnecessary delays and uncertainty and red tape. Especially right now with everything that's going on affecting Canada's economy, our trading relationships, everything going on now related to the conflict in the Middle East and the oil supply shock. That there's some real opportunities that Canada can take advantage of. So are we serious about doing so? So this new report lays out a blueprint in which we can do so. Attract needed investment, really bolster our economy, export to other markets, contribute meaningfully to global supply at a time where that's become all that much more crucial. So joining us now to talk more about this report, From Barriers to Breakthroughs, and you can read more at businesscouncilab.com. Very pleased to welcome to the program President of the Business Council of Alberta, Adam Legge. Adam, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having us on, Rob.
Now, first of all, I call this a report, but this was quite a massive undertaking. This was a year's worth of work. I believe over 150 different experts and industry insiders pulled in. Tell us a bit more about this process.
Yeah, Rob, thank you. It's been a year of work with our members, with experts in business and regulatory affairs and major project approvals. We retained the law firm Osler to help us, in fact, rewrite sections of Bill C-69. We've talked to other policy advisors, et cetera, and really also engage government to make sure they're part of the process. So we've really developed a major body of work that is, how can Canada increase the amount of business investment in major projects? How can we cut red tape, reduce regulatory burden, so that we can actually get more investment into Canada and create more jobs and prosperity all across this nation?
Yeah, I think we've seen over the last year, not only is there a need for this, but how much of a challenge there still is. We've had the creation of the Major Projects Office. We've had the MOU between Alberta and Ottawa, but progress has been slow, it feels like. So what does this report tell us about, the barriers, the obstacles that exist?
Well, Rob, if we look at where Canada sits, the World Bank did a study of 100 countries in terms of their regulatory systems. Canada ranked 33rd. We were one better than China at 34. Our biggest competitor, the United States, was 5th. And if you look at how the business investment compared to the United States over the past decade, Canada's business investment per worker has dropped over 10% in that decade, where in the US it's grown over 35%. So we're just seeing capital go elsewhere because other locations around the world are more attractive. Instead of generating and approving major projects in Canada, we've regulated them out of existence. And really the big barriers are that the process is slow. It's cumbersome, it's unpredictable, it's too fraught with political interference. A minister or prime minister can come along at the end of a process, multi-year process, $100 of million process, like we saw with Northern Gateway, and pull the permit so the project never sees the light of day. So there isn't a CEO in the country that would stand in front of their board and ask for capital to invest in a process where they don't know how long it's going to take, they don't know what they're going to be faced with, and they don't know if they're actually going to get it at the 11th hour pulled away from them. So capital goes where there's less friction and there's less barriers. And so they're going to the United States, they're going to Australia, they're going to places that welcome them and create that process that's fast, it's certain, it's predictable, and it enables capital to flow.
Right, and I think clearly there's a desire to invest in Canada. Canada has a lot of resources, a lot of advantages. There's a demand for what Canada has, so it's not a question of whether there would be that investment. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, and this report speaks to it, right, that there is a desire to make those investments.
There's a huge amount of appetite, both from our members in the council, but also from international investors. Canada has there's really attractive investments, whether it's our resource base in energy and agriculture, critical minerals, whether it's investment in the pure infrastructure itself, whether that is a pipeline or whether that's a port. All of these things have great investment potential. But when a company looks at the time and the uncertainty, they're just going elsewhere. Canada just cannot seem to get out of its own way to create a regulatory and approval system that will compete with the other places that are really attracting capital right now. So it's not for a lack of trying, not for a lack of desirability. It's from a lack of certainty and predictability.
And that's not to say we automatically rubber stamp these kinds of projects. I mean, clearly there's a need to have a meaningful process, meaningful consultation. How do we find the balance there?
A great point, Rob. As we roll out this project, many have perhaps said that, are you looking at reducing any of the environmental regulations or controls or Indigenous consultations? And nothing could be further from the truth. Our members want to make sure that environmental standards are upheld. So we're wanting to ensure that all of the environmental processes are still in place, they're still robust, that the Indigenous consultation frameworks are there, they're clear, they're still robust. There's huge opportunities and requirement to engage with Indigenous communities with respect to specific projects. We want to make sure those are all protected and preserved, and quite frankly, that all these projects are a benefit to the national interest. They benefit communities, they benefit Canadians, they create jobs, they help generate tax revenues. But what we're just saying is that there are too many overlapping, duplicative processes. So when a major project, for example, goes into the federal government, it gets one set of reviews on the approval basis, and then when they want to go get permits, a lot of that happens all over again. It's a duplicative. It's really not necessary to do all of that over again. We're just saying have one project, one approval, one decision that encompasses all of that, and you can create a much shorter timeline by streamlining and making less repetitive work for the proponents.
Does a lot of this fall then at the federal government's feet? I mean, the Impact Assessment Act, these other pieces of legislation that govern all of this, a lot of that is federal. So is this Ottawa's mess to fix? And are we talking about some minor legislative changes or are these significant overhauls?
Well, it largely is within the federal jurisdiction, a lot of this work here that we're proposing. Not to say that the provinces across the country can't do better, and there are ways in which the provincial regulatory approval systems can always be improved. But ultimately, given the sort of constitutional superiority of the federal government to a lot of this legislation, it really is federal legislation that needs to change. You mentioned the Impact Assessment Act. We have worked with legal firm Osler to rewrite sections of that to create the certainty, reduce the timelines, reduce the duplication. We've proposed changes. So, for example, to have all pipelines reviewed by the Canada Energy Regulator, whereas now there's a blend between the Canada Energy Regulator and the Impact Assessment Agency. We'd want to see all projects that happen only within provincial bounds be determined by the provincial regulatory bodies. So there is a variety of change. It is not tweaking at the edges, Rob, and I think that's one of the challenges that the federal government has often just said, well, we'll just tweak this here and there. We saw that as their response when Bill C-69 was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. The response by the minister was, well, just make some tweaks, and that's why it is back in court again being challenged. So this needs to have some fairly significant overhaul. We can't tweak. We can't just sort of nibble around the edges. If we want to truly compete for investment in major projects, it does need some pretty significant change.
Right. I think, speeding up the process to get results quicker has some obvious payoff. But I think a lot of this, too, is just about some certainty, right? And investment needs certainty. Is that something we lack in Canada right now?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest areas of uncertainty is the political interference. And that is something that right now, under the Impact Assessment Act, a minister can designate a project, even if they just hear about it or are made aware of it, without even having it being filed for approval. They can then also come along at the 11th hour and pull a permit after the agency and after regulatory bodies have approved a project. A minister or a prime minister can still pull that. As I mentioned before, no CEO is going to go forward with that. So we're suggesting the change needs to be that any political decision making happens at the front end. So cabinet, ministers all get the ability to weigh in and say, is this a project that's good for the country? Is it of a national interest? Should this project go ahead? That's their moment of opportunity to say yes or no. If they do say yes, it would then go through the regulatory process, and they cannot intervene after that, to give some certainty to investors and proponents that if the federal government deems it in the national interest, and then the project stands on its own merits from a regulatory, environmental, Indigenous consultation perspectives, and that the regulator has the final say. So that would remove a huge element of the uncertainty that currently exists in Canada's framework. And we think that would be a massive shift, a massive boost of confidence to investors to go forward with project investments.
Just on the moment we face right now, I mean, there's never a bad time to address unnecessary delays or red tape. I mean, there's never a bad time to make yourself an attractive jurisdiction for investment. But just with everything going on globally right now, the economic pressure, the trade pressure Canada's facing, why is this so crucial to get right and to address right now?
Well, the sad reality, Rob, is that over the past few years, we've seen many of our friends and allies come to our shores asking for our resources, whether it was the early days of the invasion in Ukraine, when Europe was coming asking for our natural gas. We told them there was no business case and sent them home with a green hydrogen agreement. And now with the Iran conflict, we're seeing again our allies coming to our shores saying, can you help us with additional natural resources, particularly energy, but also in areas of fertilizer and food. Again, we do not have the ability to grow our export capacity in a quick order. We're tapped out in terms of all of our export flows, both whether it is at ports for fertilizer and grain, whether it is oil and gas. We just do not have the ability to turn the dial and increase outflows and exports. So that is a real sad position for the country to be in. We should be doing better. We're blessed with natural resources, and I think we could be doing the world a whole heck of a lot of good if we had the ability to open up the flows and increase our exports in an environment where we were enabling project approvals to happen much faster.
Yeah. Well, certainly, I think there's some urgency to this, and let's hope the government, takes a cue from some of these recommendations. The report is called From Barriers to Breakthroughs. Much more is mentioned. Business Council AB.com. Adam, thanks again for making some time for us here. Really appreciate this.
My pleasure, Rob. Anytime. Thank you.
All right. Once again, that is Adam Legge. He is president of the Business Council of Alberta. You can read more on this report at businesscouncilab.com. And like I say, hopefully the government's paying attention to this. And they're prepared to get serious. I mean, look, Mark Carney has talked a good game. We've seen the announcements about the Build in Canada Act and the Major Projects Office, but so far, what do we see in terms of results? So I think he needs to deliver, and so here's a way in which maybe he could do so. I mean, if he sees a different way of getting there, then fine. But I think we need to get beyond the rhetoric, and it's really time for some action when it comes to spurring investment, building these major projects. Of course, there is still the MOU between Alberta and Ottawa, and we just passed the April 1st deadline for some aspects of that MOU, and we didn't see the progress that was supposed to be there before April 1st. I mean, hopefully that's not too worrying just yet. We're hearing all the right things from both the Alberta government and the federal government. The progress is being made. So that's one avenue where I think, we can make some meaningful headway in dealing with all of these issues. But there's a broader conversation just when it comes to all of the different barriers that discourage investment in Canada at a time when we badly need it. So our thanks again to Adam Legge. Also thanks again to Alberta NDP leader Naheed Nenshi. Interesting conversation about where his party finds itself in light of what's happening with their federal cousins, and of course all the issues that we're dealing with right now in Alberta. But listen, that's where I'll leave it for this episode of the podcast. Of course, you can find us on the podcast audio platforms, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, etc. And find our YouTube channel as well, video of all episodes, YouTube, a Rob Breakenridge Show at YouTube. So you can check us out there. And also, of course, our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Folks, have yourselves a safe and enjoyable Easter long weekend. We will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with The Rob Breakenridge Show.